people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. An insightful tweet from the former WBO super featherweight champion, now retired, Jamel Herring, who stated, "Let's be honest, Serrano should have been fighting Taylor in a rematch to begin with. Trying to secure what was pretty much a quick cash grab backfired. Now everyone goes home empty-handed," referencing the now defunct Jake Paul versus Hasim Rahman fight, the fight where Amanda Serrano was supposed to defend her two alphabet titles on the undercard against mandatory challenger Brenda Carabajal. It seems that Jamel Herring is right.
She should have chosen to go right into a Katie Taylor rematch because she would have got more money in the process of doing so.
But in many ways, Team Serrano chose the path of least resistance because a Brenda Carabajal fight at featherweight is a more winnable fight than a Katie Taylor rematch at lightweight.
You still get people arguing that Amanda Serrano won that fight based on 2 or 3 dramatic rounds.
I understand that those rounds were dramatic. I understand that Amanda Serrano came very close to actually stopping Katie Taylor. But what happened in the other?
You're stuck on what happened in a dramatic 2 or 3 rounds. What happened in the other 7?
Because it is a 10-round fight after all, and Amanda Serrano didn't actually knock out Katie Taylor. It went to the cards. It went to a decision.
People see what they want to see.
Block out what they don't. It seems that Jamel Herring is making a very valid point that, you know, in the hands of the very capable individuals over there at Matchroom, Amanda Serrano would be en route to another sizable payday in a Katie Taylor rematch. Granted that it might have come at the cost of her IBF title, Brenda Carabajal being the mandatory challenger to the IBF title.
Yeah, it might have come at the cost of that belt, but what are your priorities?
Keeping one of 2 belts at 126 pounds or fighting for all the belts at 135 pounds for more money.
Priorities.
Where Amanda goes from here, and when she's going to get back out there, your guess is as good as mine. This was supposed to be Jake Paul's first fight of this year, you understand.
There's a blame game going on. A he said, she said kind of deal.
We're going to talk about that, the gory details in reference to the collapse of Jake Paul versus Hasim Rahman. Better still, Amanda was supposed to fight on that card, and that card has now been canceled with a little over a week's time left.
It was all supposed to go down next week, and look what happened.
On the surface, on the face of it, it might have seemed the safer, more logical choice to participate in a fight on Jake Paul's undercard as opposed to participating in another Matchroom show against Katie Taylor in a foreign country. But why should that bother Amanda when Katie Taylor fought her in her neck of the woods?
Yeah.
Amanda's from New York City, and that's where the fight between them took place.
Yeah.
We know that some weeks after the fight, not that long ago, there was angling by way of the Amanda Serrano people, Jake Paul, saying they'd like for Katie Taylor to come down to featherweight. They've got $2 million for her. I have no idea how they intended for Katie to get down that low when Katie's never campaigned as a featherweight, not as an amateur and not as a professional, least of all in her mid-30s. It seems they were asking Katie Taylor to do something they knew she couldn't do to help Amanda save face.
That's exactly what they were doing, helping Amanda save face for walking away from the rematch.
Walking away from the rematch to participate in a smaller, more winnable fight against a more beatable fighter.
Now that a dance card ain't booked, do you think she'll revisit the Taylor rematch?
Or do you think she'll wait to get back out there on the next undercard of one of Jake Paul's fights whenever he does fight, since it's becoming increasingly difficult to pin down opponents for this guy? Don't forget that Hasim Rahman Jr. was intended to be a stand-in for Tommy Fumbles, who ended up not being able to fight Jake. Same seems to apply to Hasim Rahman Jr.
Different reasons, though all the same. They're struggling to pin down opponents for Pake Jaw.
Will Amanda Serrano so decide to revisit the Katie Taylor rematch on the heels of Jake Paul's cancellation?
I'm not sure.
But Jamel Herring makes a very valid point. If she would have decided to face Katie Taylor for a second time, that fight would have been over the line by now, and she would have been en route to that and another career-high purse instead of
looking to reschedule a fight date for a Brenda Carabajal fight.
I mean, yeah, it just is what it is.
Here's what happened, long story short. So he signed a contract to fight me at 200 pounds and was going to cut the weight down to 200 pounds. This is not a big cut for him, right? He's a big guy with a ton of weight to lose. So he sent a video into the commission the first time he weighed in at 216 pounds. The commission wanted to track his weight cut to make sure he was doing it in a healthy way. 3 weeks later, the commission asked him for an update on his weight. He sends a video weighing 215 pounds, meaning in 3 weeks, he only lost 1 pound. So the commission was like, hey man, you're not cutting the weight properly. We don't want you to lose it all in the last day. We're gonna have to change this fight to 205 pounds. My team calls me up. They're like, hey, man, do you want to change? They want to change the weight to 205 pounds. That's a big difference. You normally fight at 190 pounds. Do you want to do the fight still? I said, no problem. Let's do it. 205 pounds. He already has a weight advantage, height advantage, reach advantage, all of these things. But whatever. I know I can still beat his ass at 205 pounds. And that was that. We move forward. And then today, out of nowhere, his team calls and says, Hasim's not going lower than 215 pounds. If the fight's not at 215 pounds, then we're pulling out. My manager goes, fuck you guys. You're not in control of this. We already agreed to 5 more pounds. He is a big guy. Losing 10 pounds, everyone knows in the sport of boxing that is an easy weight cut. People do that. UFC champions cut 25 pounds overnight to make weight. A 10-pound weight cut for a heavyweight is nothing. This is clearly an excuse. So they say, okay, the fight's not at 215, we're out.
Let me go ahead and kill all this internet cat Jake Paul got going on for y'all. Look, I'm a bridgerweight. I campaign at bridgerweight, or otherwise known as heavyweight outside of the WBC. Now look, I signed a contract to make 200 pounds within the 3 or 3.5 weeks that I had to do it, but I couldn't do it. My body simply would not let me do it, would not let me get down to 200 pounds. But where in boxing do y'all see them canceling fights a whole week in advance? I didn't even get my last week to get down as low as I could. I told this man, it's penalties involved. Keep the purse. Keep the purse. I fight you for the $5,000 minimum. That's how much it means to me, and that's how much faith I have in knocking him out. I would have beat this man with one hand, just like I did in the gym. But let him tell it. He already beat my ass in the gym when I was 230. So if you beat me up while I was 230, what's the problem in fighting me while I'm 215? What's the problem fighting me at 210? It's clearly them not wanting to fight. It's not me pulling out the fight. It's them not wanting to fight.
Now that the dust and the smoke has had time to settle and we've heard both sides of the story, what's consistent with both Jake Paul's version of things and Hasim Rahman's version of things is that Hasim Rahman couldn't make the weight.
And he admitted that himself.
The discrepancy between the stories seems to be who decided to pull out, who decided to call off the fight. Was it Team Rahman or Team Paul?
That's the disconnect.
But as far as Hasim Rahman not being able to get down to a contracted weight of 200 pounds, that seems to be consistent both sides of the story. And to that, Ryan Gersha tweeted, if you sign a contract to fight at a weight and then later you decide you can't because reality hit you, then that's on you. Don't agree to something you knew you weren't capable of and then expect for everyone to just oblige to your misstep. Hasim Rahman Jr. chose to respond to Ryan saying, I told the truth. I didn't pull out with some bullshit, my mind's not right for boxing excuse. You been soft, boy. Get the fuck out of here. To which Ryan replied, hard to get my thoughts right with things like this. I just said don't sign something you can't or are not capable.
Ryan's not wrong, you know.
I don't care what you think about how many times he pulled out of a fight. I don't care what you think about him as a boxer and all the stuff he's got going on with Gervonta Davis. The one thing Ryan Garcia imparted that rings true is you shouldn't sign a contract that you can't honor, because when you can't honor it, it's not on anybody else. It's on you.
This isn't about whether or not you like Ryan Garcia or whether or not you like his chances against Gervonta.
This isn't about anything other than Hasim Rahman signing a contract for a contracted weight of 200 pounds against Jake Paul and his inability to deliver on a deadline.
Maybe he thought he could do it at the time he signed the contract, but he quickly found out that he couldn't. Didn't have enough time.
He was a late replacement. He was a stand-in opponent, after all, a stand-in opponent for Tommy Fury. And maybe at the time the ink hit the paper, Hasim thought he could pull it off. He could do it.
But he was wrong, and that's on him. That's not on Jake.
So is that really all that's going on here? A Twitter account that goes by the name Fight Oracle stated, here's what happened. Joke and the Warlock knew Rahman would be heavy from day one. That was never the issue. The issue is they sold virtually no tickets. Madison Square Garden is very expensive to run. Pay-per-view was trending badly, so they used Rahman's weight as the out.
It's compelling because I heard that the tickets weren't moving for this thing.
And Hasim Rahman Jr., legitimate pugilist that he might be, he doesn't have the name value and notoriety of a Ben Askren or a Tyrone Woodley and what notoriety they amassed as UFC fighters in their heyday. He doesn't bring that to the table the way they did.
It's not hard for me to believe that they were struggling to sell this fight, and they might have called it off on that premise.
This way, Joke, Warlock, gets to save face. They don't have to come clean and say, I couldn't sell tickets and the pay-per-view would have bombed. Joke and the Warlock got the New York State Athletic Commission involved with Rahman's weight, so there's a paper trail. Rahman was 215 pounds. Joke was fine with that.
According to Fight Oracle, the real issue is the fight wasn't selling. Tickets weren't moving.
It wasn't the weight. Jake was fine with the weight, but he wasn't fine with zero ticket sales, shitty pay-per-view numbers, and having to pay Serrano's purse. The issue was never Rahman's weight. Joke was cool with that. Knew he'd be heavy. It only became an issue when it was clear the show was in financial disaster.
Both teams are going back and forth with each other over social media in an effort to save face.
In order to salvage their reputations, though in truth, Jake Paul isn't viewed as this pillar of truth and pillar of dignity in the boxing community to where this really hurts his reputation. This is in keeping with what you'd expect from Jake Paul and one of his fights and what he really is, a novelty act until further notice.
I don't think any of this hurts Jake Paul's reputation all that much, or Hasim Rahman Jr.'s for that matter.
Before this fight, before Jake Paul even started dealing with this guy, Hasim Rahman didn't have a reputation to hurt. Because nobody knew who he was.
I don't think this fight's collapse makes either guy look all that bad, regardless of whose version of the story you want to go with.
All right, Jake, I'm filming.
So guys, I'm in the hospital. I had an accident. I'm still gonna be able to fight August 6th, so get your tickets at msg.com before they sell out. But I broke my back carrying the promotion for this event. It's broken.
Oh, Jake, you good?
Nurse!
Jake,
Nurse,
you
more
good?
morphine!
Oh my God.
I broke my back carrying the last 5 fights promotion.
You're used to this.
My opponents never sell
Do
shit.
something.
Oh, it hurts!
You want
Do
mouth
something.
to
It
mouth?
hurts!
Mouth to mouth?
These motherfuckers never sell shit!
This comedic outburst was filmed earlier this month on the 18th, and you'll notice what Jake Paul was saying, that he's carrying the promotion all on his own, that his opponent isn't helping him sell any tickets. It was, 1 or 2 weeks ago? Now, why would Jake Paul feel it necessary to upload something like this if the tickets were moving the way he wanted them to move, the way the powers that be would have wanted them to move? Why would he deem it necessary to do this?
You know what they say about comedy? There's always a little bit of truth in humor.
There's always a little bit of truth sprinkled in there, and remember what Fight Oracle said. What's really happening here is they're deciding to call the fight off because in all likelihood it would be a box office flop and it wouldn't generate any revenue at the gate. None at the gate because the tickets aren't moving. This ain't a former UFC champion that Jake Paul was set to face, you understand. This ain't Tyrone Woodley. This ain't Ben Askren. Those two UFC MMA guys have more of a profile than Hasim Rahman Jr.
They do. Those guys have more of a profile, more notoriety. Hell, even Nate Robinson, even Ensign Gibb.
Up until this point, everyone that Jake Paul has fought, to some degree, came into the situation with a following of their own, with a profile of their own. Whereas with Hasim Rahman Jr., the most that you can say about him is in reference to his father and his father's career, his father's exploits, what he did as a fighter, not his son. Nothing against him, but...
Oh, I think some people didn't even know Hasim Rahman Jr. had a son that was boxing, and the ones that did already know he was coming off a loss, a knockout loss ahead of this fight.
In a nutshell, swapping out Hasim Rahman Jr. for Tommy Fury didn't lend itself to the fight's overall profile because Hasim Rahman Jr. doesn't have a big following. He doesn't have a following at all. In fact, I think the most attention he's gotten as a boxer was in reference to this fight with Jake Paul.
So Fight Oracle's contention that the real reason they called this thing off was due to low ticket sales.
It's not the craziest theory I've ever heard. As far as the blame game, who's really at fault here, Hasim Rahman Jr. or Jake Paul? Like I said, I am less and less concerned with how this affects either fighter's reputation because neither one of them had all that much of a reputation to begin with. They're not pillars of the boxing community to where they have reputations or had reputations to her.
Neither one of them had all that much of a reputation to where this ruins them.
If this entire fiasco has affected anyone's reputation adversely, I'd say it's hurt Showtime's reputation as a platform more than it's hurt Jake Paul. Jake Paul is what he is. You take him at face value.
But these are the guys that are trying to sell him to you. These are the guys who a few days ago expressed a long-term commitment to Jake Paul,
saying that they are in the Jake Paul business for the long haul. If this entire fiasco has affected anybody's reputation in any way,
this is bad optics for Showtime because they're the ones that decided to go into business with this guy, and this is what they got for their money.
This is what they have to show for it. At a time when they're struggling to get the Terrence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight over the line, saying that they are at an impasse, that they're a bit stuck. At a time where all of that is going on, this is also happening. This is also going on. So you're struggling to put together legitimate boxing matches between legitimate boxers, and you're struggling to put together novelty acts.
I can care less about the blame game that Jake and Hasim are playing with each other.
Who's at fault? Who's caused the fight to collapse? For all I know, they're both in on it, and they both mutually decided, let's call this thing off because we're not going to make any money.
Your guess is as good as mine, but I'm not really concerned how this affects either of them or their respective reputations.
I feel like if anybody's reputation has been affected adversely by all of this as of late, it's got to be Stephan Espinoza. It's got to be Showtime as a platform.
Stephan Espinoza, who regularly takes jabs at Eddie Hearn and the DAZN platform, but I want you to notice something.
DAZN as a platform, respectively, hasn't struggled to get their major fights over the line this year. They haven't. They've got the Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin trilogy booked, ready to go. They've got the Joshua versus Usyk rematch ready to go as well. And they're also putting on a novelty act between social media influencers the same way that Showtime just tried to. The KSI versus Wasabi thingamajig.
Whatever the fuck that thing is.
You often hear it said, Eddie Hearn doesn't know what he's doing, and DAZN is a failing platform. Well, what they're not failing at is to get the goddamn job done, because they've got all their major fights booked, and those are all bigger fights than Terrence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. would have been, or would be, should be, if Showtime ever gets the goddamn job done.
Some part of me feels like the chickens are coming home to roost for Stephan Espinoza.
Some part of me feels that this is karma. That's what we're looking at. That's what this is. All these hiccups, all these bumps in the road that Stephan Espinoza and Showtime are facing, having played a party to fights being blocked in the past, they are now struggling to put on fights.
Because they have been a party to the PBC shenanigans.
I can't fight this feeling that there's karma at work here, that the chickens really are coming home to roost for Stephan Espinoza, as he regularly undermines Eddie Hearn's efforts to make the biggest, most attractive fights in boxing, whilst he himself is struggling to keep up.
I mean, you tell me, what's the biggest and best fight that Showtime has scheduled for the remainder of 2022?
That is a legitimate question. What fights on that scale, that scope, that arena, is Showtime putting on this year?
How are you supposed to compete with DAZN when you can't even get novelty fights over the line?